I'm supposed to be recording this while I still can. Not because I'm in danger, at least not the kind you'd recognize, but because I made a choice 3 weeks ago that I can't reverse, and now I need someone else to know what I found before the opportunity passes, before certain doors close permanently, before the pattern I've started to see becomes impossible to ignore. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent 15 years authenticating medieval manuscripts, paleography, codicology, diplomatic analysis, the quiet, meticulous work of dating parchment and matching scribal hands to known exemplars. It's methodical, predictable, safe. I've examined incunabula in Munich, verified papal bulls in the Vatican secret archives, authenticated a supposed Carolingian gospel book that turned out to be an 18th century forgery so sophisticated it had fooled 3 institutions for nearly a decade. My reputation is built on precision, on skepticism, on trusting physical evidence over intuition, on letting the documents speak for themselves. I tell you this so you understand. I am not someone who jumps to conclusions. I am not someone who sees conspiracies in coincidences. I am trained to doubt, to verify, to demand proof. So when the email arrived offering triple my usual rate for a single translation, I assumed it was a wealthy collector with more money than patience. The message was formal, clinical, stripped of unnecessary detail. They needed someone who specialized in late medieval Latin with particular experience in theological marginalia and commentary traditions. The manuscript was privately held, non-circulating collection. Location, Rome. Duration, 2 weeks, possibly 3. The sender's address was institutional but deliberately vague. No university affiliation, no foundation name, no research institute. Just an office number and a street in Trastevere I'd never heard of, despite having worked in Rome on 4 separate occasions. I should have found that strange. I didn't. I accepted the commission within an hour. The address led to a building I'd passed a dozen times without noticing. 19th century facade, limestone worn smooth by decades of weather and pollution. No nameplate beside the heavy wooden door, no brass plaque, no indication of what happened inside or who owned the property. The entrance was locked. I rang the bell and waited in the October rain. The woman who answered didn't introduce herself. Mid-50s, gray blazer over a white blouse, hair pulled back with the kind of geometric severity that suggests habit rather than fashion. She asked for identification, checked my passport against a list on her tablet, handed me a visitor badge with no photograph, no name, just a number in sans serif font, 447.
I'm supposed to be recording this while I still can. Not because I'm in danger, at least not the kind you'd recognize, but because I made a choice 3 weeks ago that I can't reverse. And now I need someone else to know what I found before the opportunity passes, before certain doors close permanently, before the pattern I've started to see becomes impossible to ignore. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent 15 years authenticating medieval manuscripts, paleography, codicology, diplomatic analysis, the quiet, meticulous work of dating parchment and matching scribal hands to known exemplars. It's methodical, predictable, safe. I've examined incunabula in Munich, verified papal bulls in the Vatican's secret archives, authenticated a supposed Carolingian gospel book that turned out to be an 18th century forgery so sophisticated it had fooled 3 institutions for nearly a decade. My reputation is built on precision, on skepticism, on trusting physical evidence over intuition, on letting the documents speak for themselves. I tell you this so you understand. I am not someone who jumps to conclusions. I am not someone who sees conspiracies in coincidence. I am trained to doubt, to verify, to demand proof. So when the email arrived offering triple my usual rate for a single translation, I assumed it was a wealthy collector with more money than patience. The message was formal, clinical, stripped of unnecessary detail. They needed someone who specialized in late medieval Latin with particular experience in theological marginalia and commentary traditions. The manuscript was privately held, non-circulating collection. Location, Rome. Duration, 2 weeks, possibly 3. The sender's address was institutional, but deliberately vague. No university affiliation, no foundation name, no research institute. Just an office number and a street in Trastevere I'd never heard of, despite having worked in Rome on 4 separate occasions. I should have found that strange. I didn't. I accepted the commission within an hour. The address led to a building I'd passed a dozen times without noticing. 19th century facade, limestone worn smooth by decades of weather and pollution. No nameplate beside the heavy wooden door, no brass plaque, no indication of what happened inside or who owned the property. The entrance was locked. I rang the bell and waited in the October rain. The woman who answered didn't introduce herself. Mid-50s, gray blazer over a white blouse, hair pulled back with the kind of geometric severity that suggests habit rather than fashion. She asked for identification, checked my passport against a list on her tablet, handed me a visitor badge with no photograph, no name, just a number printed in sans serif font, 447.
Inside, the air had that particular stillness you only find in places designed to keep things rather than welcome people. The floors were polished marble, cream-colored, slightly uneven from age. The walls were bare except for old electrical fixtures that had been painted over so many times they'd lost their original shape. We walked past offices with frosted glass doors. No names, no sounds, no indication of occupancy. At the time, I read this as discretion, professional confidentiality. She led me downstairs without speaking. The stairwell was narrow, clearly not part of the building's original design. The lighting was fluorescent and flickered at irregular intervals with a frequency that made my eyes ache. We descended 3 levels, maybe 4. I lost count because the landings all looked identical. The reading room was smaller than I expected, perhaps 3 meters by 4. A single table, a single chair. Climate control humming steadily in the ceiling, maintaining temperature and humidity at archival standards. One camera mounted in the corner with a lens that followed our movement as we entered. The manuscript was already waiting on the table. Before I could approach it, the woman produced a non-disclosure agreement. 6 pages, single-spaced, dense legal language. The word proprietary appeared 7 times. Confidential appeared 11. There were clauses about derivative materials, about digital reproduction, about unauthorized disclosure to third parties or affiliated institutions. The penalties section took up an entire page and included phrases like liquidated damages and injunctive relief. I signed it. I've signed hundreds of NDAs. This is normal in private collections. She witnessed my signature with a fountain pen. Then she left without instruction, closing the door with a soft click. The manuscript sat in a foam cradle designed for much larger volumes, vellum, approximately 320 folios, though several gatherings appeared to be missing based on the quire structure, bound in wooden boards with iron clasps that had oxidized unevenly, suggesting repeated opening and closing in a humid environment over centuries. The leather spine was almost entirely deteriorated, reduced to fragments held together by instinct. I started with the standard protocols, drew on the white cotton gloves they'd provided in a sealed package, examined the quiring structure with a penlight. The gatherings were mostly regular, quinions, the standard 5 by folium gathering, but with several irregular insertions and omissions that disrupted the mathematical pattern. I checked the pricking patterns along the margins. Consistent ruling, professional execution. This was scriptorium work, not a private commission. The script was a formal Gothic textualis, consistent with late 13th century production. Northern Italy almost certainly. The letter forms had that characteristic angularity, the compressed spacing, the hierarchical distinction between majuscules and minuscules. The abbreviations were standard for the period. Possibly Tuscany, possibly Bologna. The ink was iron gall, well preserved, with minimal fading except where moisture had touched certain pages. I photographed the binding from 6 angles, measured the folios with digital calibers, documented the quire signatures, small Roman numerals in the lower margins that indicated the original ordering. Then I began reading. The text itself was unremarkable at first glance, a commentary on Genesis, creation narrative structured around the familiar 6-day framework, the formation of light and darkness, the separation of waters above from waters below, the emergence of dry land, genealogies from Adam through Noah reconciled with patristic chronology. The usual exegetical apparatus you'd expect from a monastic scriptorium trying to harmonize scriptural authority with Aristotelian natural philosophy. The Latin was competent, occasionally elegant. The scribe knew his sources: Augustine, Jerome, Bede, Isidore of Seville. There were direct quotations, properly attributed. There were allusions to Greek texts available only in translation, standard intellectual furniture for a learned commentary. But the margins were different. Someone had added annotations in a later hand, not glosses, not the typical corrections or clarifications you find in working manuscripts, not reader's marks or memoria notations. These were instructions, directives, procedural notes, written in the same Latin but with phrasing that felt profoundly wrong for the period. Too precise, too systematic. The terminology belonged to a different intellectual tradition entirely. Where the main text discussed the creation of the firmament on the second day, the marginal note read, "Sequence compromised here. Refer to alternative version for structural integrity." Alternative version. As if multiple iterations existed. Where Genesis described the fourth day, the creation of sun and moon to govern time, the annotation said, "Temporal calibration uncertain. Requires cross-reference to unlisted exemplar." Unlisted. Not lost, not destroyed. Unlisted. I documented everything with the archival camera they'd provided, a fixed-mount system positioned above the table that prevented me from controlling the angle or removing the memory card. Every photograph was time-stamped and watermarked automatically. Made detailed notes about ink composition, script evolution, textual variants, caudilogical anomalies. That's when I saw the symbol for the first time. It appeared on folio 47. In the margin beside a passage about divine ordering, about the intentional structure of creation. A geometric form composed of 3 interlocking elements, 2 circles of different sizes intersecting at mathematically precise points, connected by 3 straight lines that created internal angles of exactly 60 degrees. The whole thing formed something between a glyph and a diagram, beautiful in its economy, deliberate in its precision, rendered in the same ink as the marginal annotations. I'd never seen anything like it in 15 years of manuscript work. It appeared again on folio 93, then folio 116, then scattered across the final third of the manuscript in what seemed like irregular intervals, always in the margin, never explained, never referenced in the main text or the annotations. 7 times total, by my count, though I couldn't be certain without examining every page. I would only understand the significance of that number much later. I flagged it in my preliminary report, sketched it carefully in my notebook, asked in my evening email to the archivist if there were companion volumes, other manuscripts from the same collection that might provide context. She appeared the next morning with my coffee, an espresso in a paper cup, which she placed on the corner of the table furthest from the manuscript. "No companion volumes," she said. Her voice was neutral, professional. "Are there other manuscripts from the same scriptorium? Anything that might share similar annotation patterns?" She paused, just half a second too long, a hesitation so brief I might have imagined it. "The collection is self-contained," she said, which wasn't an answer to my question. I kept working. On the third day, I started noticing inconsistencies in the Latin itself. Nothing obvious, nothing that would appear in a standard paleographic analysis, but the syntax in certain passages was too clean, too grammatically regular. Medieval Latin is messy. Scribes made errors. They conflated cases. They invented spellings based on phonetic intuition. They mixed classical forms with vulgar innovations. This text had sections that read like they'd been composed by someone with a printed grammar book, someone who knew the rules too well, who had studied Latin rather than inherited it. On the 6th day, I noticed something about the physical structure that should have been apparent immediately. The folios had been reordered. Not recently, the binding was old enough to confirm that this arrangement had existed for centuries, but the quire signatures didn't match the textual sequence. Someone had taken this manuscript apart,
removed sections, and reassembled it in a different order.
Or perhaps deliberately created confusion about the original arrangement. The commentary on the fourth day of creation, the passage about celestial bodies and the measurement of time, was missing 3 folios. I could see the evidence clearly. The text jumped from evening to morning without transition, from verse 18 to verse 23 with no intervening commentary. And in the binding, I could see where the sewing had been cut and reknotted using thread that matched the original material but showed different wear patterns, different aging. Someone had removed those pages carefully, professionally, then closed the gap so seamlessly that a casual examination would miss it entirely. I mentioned this to the archivist during one of her periodic checks. She appeared every 2 hours, always at the same times, always for exactly 3 minutes. She nodded as though I'd confirmed something she already knew. "Are there other versions?" I asked directly. "Versions?" "Of this text, other manuscript witnesses. This appears to be fragmentary, deliberately incomplete." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't parse. Professional, neutral, deliberately empty. The look you give someone when you're deciding what they're permitted to know. "This is the only copy we hold," she said carefully, which still wasn't an answer to my question. I returned to the annotations with new attention, started cross-referencing them against my own database of marginal commentaries, 10,000 examples collected over a decade of work, medieval glosses, Renaissance addenda, early modern corrections, Reformation-era polemics. Found nothing that matched the vocabulary or the style. Expanded the search to include scientific manuscripts, alchemical treatises, astronomical tables, medical compendia. Still nothing. The vocabulary was wrong, too technical, too specialized. It referenced processes, calibration, sequence, initialization, structural verification, systematic fragmentation that had no place in 13th century theological commentary. These were terms from a different intellectual universe entirely. Terms that belonged to disciplines that didn't exist yet. Or terms that had been deliberately obscured. On the 9th day, I found a second document. Not in the manuscript itself, in the archive's digital catalog system. I was searching for comparative exemplars, other Genesis commentaries from the same period and region, when a record appeared in the results that shouldn't have been accessible through my login credentials. A single-line entry. No title, no date, no author attribution, no description field. Just a call number, ms.r.447.3. The same number as my visitor badge, and beside it, in red capital letters, restricted. I clicked on the entry. The screen flickered, white text on black background, then an error message, insufficient access privileges, request denied. I screenshotted the entry on my phone before the window closed. That afternoon, during the scheduled break when I was permitted to leave the reading room for exactly 15 minutes, I found the archivist in the corridor outside. She was reviewing something on her tablet, standing beneath one of the flickering fluorescent lights. "I have a question about the catalog system," I said. She looked up, waited. "I found a reference to a restricted document, ms.r.447.3. Is there any possibility of access for comparative purposes?" Her face didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. A tightening across the shoulders, a slight adjustment in how she held the tablet, a recalculation happening behind her eyes. "That section is not part of your commission," she said quietly. "I understand, but if there are related materials that might clarify the annotations, the symbol, the textual gaps, there are no related materials." She said it too quickly, too flatly, like a sentence she'd prepared in advance, like something she'd said before to other people asking the same question. I nodded, smiled, returned to the reading room. But now I was paying attention to other things.
The way she checked her watch when I asked certain questions. The fact that my reading room had no windows but did have that camera in the corner, always recording, red light always steady, lens adjusting slightly whenever I moved. The locked door at the end of the corridor, heavy, institutional, painted the same cream color as the walls, with a magnetic card reader and a small red light that never turned green.
That door opened twice a day, exactly 9:15 in the morning, exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. Someone in a different gray blazer would open it with a card, prop it with a wooden wedge, and move boxes inside. Always the same size boxes, always sealed with identical brown tape, always handled carefully as though the contents were fragile. I never saw what was inside them. I never saw anyone emerge. That detail didn't trouble me then. It should have. On the 11th day, I found the pattern. The symbol wasn't random. It appeared at specific textual moments, always adjacent to passages that dealt with incompleteness, with things left undone, with processes interrupted before completion. The seventh and final occurrence, on folio 281, appeared beside a passage about how certain acts of creation were intentionally left unfinished, awaiting a future fulfillment that the text described as deferred but inevitable. The marginal note beside that final symbol read, "This fragmentation is structural, not accidental. Do not attempt reconstruction without authorization." Authorization from whom? I sat with that phrase for a long time. On the 13th day, I finished the translation, compiled my analysis into a 40-page report with photographic documentation and paleographic commentary, submitted it through the archive's secure portal. The archivist accepted it without comment, said approval and payment would follow within 2 business days. Instead, 6 hours later, she appeared in the reading room holding a single manila folder. She didn't sit down. Her expression was different. Something had changed in the 6 hours since I'd last seen her. "There's been an error in our catalog," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost apologetic. "A document was misfiled, placed in the wrong access category due to a clerical error. I'm authorized to show it to you for purposes of verification only. You may not photograph it, you may not transcribe it, you may not remove it from this room. You will have 30 minutes. She placed the folder on the table and left without waiting for my response. Inside was a photocopy, poor quality, the kind you get from reproducing something very old on inadequate equipment, probably in the 1970s or early 80s. The text was in Latin, but the hand was completely different. Earlier, more archaic, Carolingian minuscule, 8th century, possibly 9th. The parchment in the original had been severely damaged. Large sections were illegible, reduced to shadows and fragments. Water damage, maybe fire. And there, in the upper right corner of the page, perfectly preserved despite everything around it being destroyed, was the symbol. Exactly the same. 3 interlocking elements. Identical proportions, perfect geometric consistency across 500 years of manuscript tradition. I read as much as I could in 30 minutes, knowing I'd never see this document again. The text was fragmentary, incomplete sentences, phrases that started and stopped without resolution, without context. It discussed something that had been left unfinished on purpose, a process that required, the word used was discontinuity, as if interruption were part of the design rather than a failure, as if gaps were intentional. There was a list, partially legible, names of cities I recognized, Alexandria, Constantinople, Cordoba, Baghdad, and others I didn't, rendered in spellings I couldn't place. Beside each name, a number. Beside each number, one of 3 phrases, exemplar destroyed, exemplar relocated, or simply status uncertain. 37 cities in total, 37 exemplars, all destroyed, relocated, or lost.
When the archivist returned exactly 30 minutes later, she took the folder without speaking, without meeting my eyes. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. I didn't ask questions. I thanked her for the opportunity, for the access, for trusting me with something clearly sensitive. She nodded once and left. I packed my materials that evening, collected my payment, transferred electronically to the account I'd specified, arriving within minutes of my departure from the building, triple the usual rate as promised. But before I left Rome, I did 3 things. First, I searched every digital archive I could access for any reference to that symbol, used every database my institutional credentials permitted, found 3 mentions across 8 centuries, one in a 16th century Venetian inventory of confiscated books, described as geometric mark of uncertain significance found in prohibited texts,
one in a 19th century auction catalogue from Vienna, listed among marginalia in a codex that was destroyed during the catalogue's production. One in a doctoral dissertation submitted to the University of Heidelberg in 1967, but never published. The title was Recurrent Non-Textual Symbols in Suppressed Manuscript Traditions. The author was a woman named Marguerite Clausen. I found her name in the university records. She submitted the dissertation in May 1967. It was rejected without explanation. She applied for resubmission. Request denied. She left the university in 1968. I searched for her subsequent publications, found nothing after that date. No articles, no books, no conference presentations, no academic appointments. Nothing. Second, I contacted 3 colleagues who specialize in medieval symbology and manuscript marginalia, sent them a carefully hand-drawn reproduction of the mark, stripped of context, asked if they'd encountered anything similar in their research. 2 never responded to my email. The third wrote back within an hour. Where did you see this? Please don't send me anything else about it. Please don't mention my name in connection with it. I respected her request. Third, I went back through my own files. 10 years of manuscript work, thousands of folios photographed, hundreds of commissions completed for universities, libraries, private collectors, auction houses. And I found it. Not the symbol itself, but the evidence that someone had removed it. A 14th century psalter from Toledo. I'd photographed every page in 2019 for a university digitization project. 473 folios, complete psalter with decorated initials and marginal illuminations. The files were clean, properly archived, stored on my personal backup drive exactly as I'd captured them. But when the university published the digital facsimile in 2021, folio 83 was missing. I opened my original photographs. Folio 83 was there. Psalm 119, decorated initial in gold leaf and ultramarine, standard iconography. And in the lower margin, barely visible beneath a later annotation, the symbol. Someone had edited it out of the published version, years after my work was finished. Without notation in the apparatus, without explanation, without acknowledgement that the folio had been modified or that anything was missing. I checked the file metadata. The published image had been accessed and altered in August 2022. Not by me, by someone with administrative credentials at the university's digital library. User ID sys.admin.09. I called the project director, left a detailed message. She never called back. I sent an email, no response. I sent a second email 2 weeks later. The address bounced back. User account closed. That was when I understood this manuscript in Rome wasn't rare. It was incomplete. And incompleteness wasn't damage. It was the point. Something had been systematically fragmented across centuries, across archives, across continents. Not destroyed. Destruction leaves evidence, creates martyrs, draws attention. fragmented, scattered, made incomplete in ways that looked like accident or time or loss. But the symbol remained, in margins, in corners, in places no one thought to look, marking the pieces, waiting. And I had just become someone who knew where to find them. What I didn't understand then was that this was only the first fragment.